The song is called Smells Like Teen Spirit.
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadromist. This is Byrne Power talking to you from Tbilisi, Georgia on a fine September evening as the weather has actually started to cool. We had rivers of water falling out of the sky last night. I love it. I don't get enough rain. That's why I lived in Southeast Alaska for so many years. I love the rain. I love the snow. I love the cooler weather. But for reasons which I've tried to elucidate elsewhere, I moved to Tbilisi, Georgia almost 6 years ago. Time continues. And I've been thinking about something I dealt with in the How We Got Here series when I dealt with the late 90s. But I've been looking at it again and thinking about how America wasted the 90s. And what I mean by that is that there were many opportunities that opened up, and we seemed to do everything we could to ignore them. And the first thing, obviously, I think what really typifies the 90s is the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of communism in most of Eastern Europe, and the end of the Soviet Union in 1991. This was an astounding thing. One could look at 1989 as perhaps the most hopeful year in the 20th century. And yet, I remember I was actually with a Russian friend named Sergei in 1991 during the weekend of the coup, and we were talking about it. Wandering around New York City. I remember going to a movie with him. Was that the time we went to see Stalker? No, it wasn't. Now, Sergei wasn't an intellect of any sort. He was actually a Russian race car driver, which was something I didn't even know existed till that moment. Soviet-era Russian race car driver. But he had moved to New York City to be near his girlfriend. And the thing that struck both of us during that weekend, as the several-day period, as the Soviet Union was ending, and something similar was happening during the fall of the Berlin Wall, was that nobody really seemed to care. That is to say, yeah, there was the news media was going on about it. It was tense. Things were happening. But as far as no one seemed to realize that this Cold War we had been engaged with since 1945 was over. There was basically, President Bush at the time said, I don't want to go there and dance on the Berlin Wall. He didn't want to make a big deal out of the fall of the Berlin Wall. He wanted to remain diplomatically, neutral or something. But essentially, America did not go through a period of rejoicing that this long struggle was over. And one of the main reasons for that was no one noticed a missing war anywhere. And the reason they didn't notice a missing war was that this culture war thing had taken over. It had already, by the early 90s, grown to a proportion that was much greater in the public's mind than whatever was happening in this place called Europe or the world. So, of course, there were Christians and right-wingers on one side, and then there were socialists No, there were gays and there were people who wanted the new world, the world which essentially we ended up creating in the late teens. But the point is, they were much more worried about their own issues with each other than they were about the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, which is really a shame. And I think so much of where we are now comes from that failure. Because for one thing, the school courses almost just extracted everything about the Cold War, and they subtracted everything about communism. And they just made it like, yes, and then this Cold War thing was over, and of course capitalism, blah, 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 and eventually although the communists and socialists and left-wingers at the time kind of took a huge hit, they were already kind of gaining control of the schools and education. And so they basically suppressed the knowledge. They no longer needed to talk about communism. No one needed to do that anymore. Now, also at the same time in the early 90s, this very dark music scene had burst into public consciousness. A lot of people say, oh yeah, it was grunge. Other people use the word alternative. It was everything. It was grunge. It was alternative. It was variations on very heavy types of metal. It was also, you'd have sweet singers like Juliana Hatfield singing songs with really dark lyrics about, shall we say, pressing the personal off button, stuff like that. It was a sense. And
were you trying to get crazy with this, eh?
Oh, don't let me forget rap music and the LA riots and all that, which were all part of the culture war stuff. But essentially, these things occupied ourselves. Now, the dark music scene was not a product of the culture war. It was a product of the rolling stream of modernism, which was then grinding out into this postmodernism. But in a sense, the end of Kurt Cobain was the end of any honest attempt at using music as a source of rebellion, although it was even nihilistic rebellion, but we can say it was modernistic rebellion. And the attitudes that people had towards Eastern Europe, I remember I was in New York City, so I was in a place where people thought a lot more about traveling to Europe because, hop on a plane, you're there. It wasn't as easy to travel as it is now, and we'll talk a bit more about travel in a moment, but I remember there were a few people I knew in New York City who in 1990, 1991 were, bam, gone. They were already in Prague. They were already there. They wanted to help them be like us, which just makes me laugh. So, of course, they were importing the dark music and such like that. Fortunately, in the Czech Republic, there's a lot of great, what do we call it, folk punk, neo-traditional music that is absolutely amazing there. Still, they created their noisy music as well, as did most of the other new countries in one form or another. But essentially, in the West, music had been an engine of this modernist rebellion. And some people say it's postmodernist. I would say yes, but I'd say the postmodernist stuff kind of came in the middle of it. It was this ironic gesture to the outside world, whereas the real modernist stuff was angry. So in a sense, punk in the late 70s was kind of like the end, the fist at the blank canvas, the black blank canvas that of modernism, the rejection of the hippie idea and such. Whereas, see, we don't really have a name for this period. All of those names I mentioned don't really describe it because there was noise and there was grunge and there was alternative and all kinds of metal, gangster rap, a lot of heavy stuff, plus other forms that weren't quite so heavy. Although then there was John Zorn doing whatever he was doing in jazz, which could be quite disturbing as well. But the point is this. there was no longer any central aspect to things. And this period was very strange for people. And yet, well, we'll talk about what happens in the future in a moment. Most people in America really didn't understand what was happening in Eastern Europe, or that Eastern Europe was often trying to reclaim itself as Central Europe. To this day, Americans will talk about Poland and the Czech Republic as being Eastern Europe, and whereas if you look at them, they're pretty much square in the middle, especially if one continues the eastern border to the Ural Mountains in Russia and to Georgia, where I live today. That's pretty east as far as Europe goes. But there was also the former Yugoslavia, which began to have problems when Slovenia broke away. Eventually, there was like a domino effect of different countries trying to resolve the issues. That Tito's government had disappeared earlier than that, but suddenly, with all these other communist governments falling apart, there was something slightly different happening in what was Yugoslavia, this collection of different countries. And that would be the battle for an extended Serbia, the Eastern-Western divide was suddenly, and this has been the big issue that led to World War I, Serbia versus Austria. And here it was again, in a different form at the end of the 20th century. Neil Ferguson makes a big point of that in one of his books about the war. I think he calls them the wars of the 20th century, or the war of the 20th century, which is if you start back with even a little bit before World War I with the Japanese-Russian War and go all the way through to the former Yugoslavian wars, it's kind of all one big thing. A massive thing that most people today just can't even get their heads around. And yet it affects everything we do. Another thing that happened at that time was that Bill Clinton really became a media president. He was always injecting himself into various things. You know, there's Bill Clinton on Saturday Night Live playing his saxophone. There's Bill Clinton in the Oval Office, shall we say, smoking cigars. There's Bill Clinton taking up far too much news time as an entertainment figure as much as anything else. During this period, things were starting to go wrong. One of the things we did was we abandoned Russia. And I mean this. Most people who look at the rise of Putin today realize that a great deal of the reason for that was that what the West did, as soon as Russia and the Soviet Union fell apart, we rushed in there with, businesses and set up various chains and, tried to get them part of the global economy. However, what was actually going on in Russia was it was being cut up and parsed, and oligarchs were being created. The average person suddenly had the value of their money taken away. And then there was this whole collapse of Asian currency that started way over in like Indonesia and Thailand, and eventually set off a massive economic collapse in Russia. And I remember at the end of the 20th century, we were reading, internet pages about cannibalism in Russia. Not capitalism, cannibalism. People were really starving. But what did we do in relationship to this? We were watching Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky. Americans just couldn't be bothered, or as the Irish and the Brits say, they couldn't be arsed to do it. It was just too much work for us. We were in this weird zone where essentially we no longer cared about the rest of the world, except for, new travel opportunities have arisen. this was also, of course, the period of the rise of the internet. So in a way, you can look at the 90s in two sections, and this is how I did it in my How We Got Here series. And you can go back and watch those if you want all the evidence for what I'm talking about. But in the first part, it was the darker part. It was the part where, the music was darker, the literature was darker, it was essentially the existential hopelessness with a smiley face on it. It was people making just ironic postmodern gestures endlessly, unable to take almost anything seriously. And then came the internet, and as people started to adopt this thing, suddenly hope emerged. Completely false hope, as it turns out. But nevertheless, people started talking about, hey, we're all going to get connected. We're all going to be able to talk to each other. We're all going to be able to, the internet is going to be the Wild West. We're going out into the new frontiers. We're going to learn all these things. We're going to connect with everyone. It just seems like such a joke now. I have to admit, I had read Jacques Ellul in the 1980s. There was not one moment I ever bought any of that hype. I never thought the internet was going to save us from anything. Yeah, it did make buying tickets easier than looking for some sort of distributor who had the tickets, someone who, I remember travel before 96 and travel when I went in 2000. But essentially, the second half of the 90s was very strange. And I've been thinking about this recently. You have the rise of what was called by the Village Voice the brat culture. And that was, suddenly you had all of this music that was slotted at teenagers, young teenagers. So you had the neo-ska movement, the pop-punk movement. You had neo-swing, and you had kind of a Latin, kind of a goofy Latin revival. People doing the Macarena, or listen to that guy singing about a little bit of blank for this and a little bit of Susie for that and whatnot. You had this silly stuff. Suddenly, the end of the 90s got really weird and silly and juvenile.
Great Malenko. Great Malenko. Great Malenko.
And then you had all these explosive action blockbusters. You had like Twister, which was one of the first of the new breed of blockbusters. You had natural disaster movies. You had Aliens. And you even had a very bad-looking Godzilla. It looked more like a lizard. If they just called it something else, it probably would have been a little more successful. But the interesting thing about these is without the Soviet Union, these were all neutral villains. They were just like not human villains. Little did we know that, I remember watching Independence Day in New York City, and when the aliens come over and blow up New York City, all the people in the audience cheered. Not me, but everyone else cheered. They were all like, yeah! And they cheered when Washington blew up and all that, which would come back with a really weird vibe after September 11th, 2001. It's almost like we were wishing upon ourselves this great failure. The economy was strong, and all this internet stuff was pushing up all these .com things. And if you know anything about the economy, you know where that's going to end up. America was unipolar. We were the policemen of the world. Russia wasn't too much, they got, like I said, things got really bad there. We were in charge, and Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia, was not just a little alcoholic. Nevertheless, we just abandoned Russia, let them, let the market sort it out kind of thing. And the Russians didn't forget that. Putin didn't forget that. But also there was this talk of the end of history, Francis Fukuyama's book, which was... most people say, September 11th took care of that argument. Or as George Will said, history is back from vacation. But the 90s was like that. It was a time where people were, what can I say? we weren't worried about anything. Well, we were. We were worried about the culture wars. We were worried about, are the gays going to take over? Are the Christians going to take over? Curiously enough, now, very often, those two aspects of the culture war are together in a more libertarian position, saying, what's going on with this new stuff, the trans stuff, and this weird variation on feminism and all this stuff. More and more you see the people who are on one side of the culture war or another, quite a few of them stayed with their respective camps, but now today you'll see many more people who are kind of center-left, center-right, some left-wing people have been pushed really far right, etc. I was just thinking about this today, that 1999, and I did some research, and this seems to be true, 1999 was the peak moment for global travel. Why? It's because more countries were open to each other at that moment than at any other time. Again, September 11th would fix that very quickly, but then Russia, and China both allow people in, but they've gotten more restrictive. And both of them were more open. Say, if you go to 1994, one thing I like about 1994 as far as travel is you don't have the Schengen group yet, this Schengen zone in Europe, which means you can go to each country and spend 3 months there, rather than spend 3 months in the totality of Europe. And I think that's really kind of hurt things personally, but I'm not going to go into trying to defend that thesis. But by 1999, even the places like Russia that had been more restricted were breathing more openly. Same with China. They were breathing more openly. And at that time, China was not traveling yet. And the problem with China traveling is, more recent statistics, they added another 150 million people to the roster, and India is growing in size as far as travel too. This is the problem where everyone gets a little, what can we say? The freedom to move and travel around. That isn't necessarily a great thing. I remember traveling in 1978 to Europe, and I kind of preferred it. And the reason I preferred it is not so many Americans were traveling. I think Americans were like 100 million or so traveling every year. That number had gone way up. All the numbers have gone up. And countries are being invaded by tourists now. Now, travel destinations are starting to get really worried about the numbers of people traveling, which is why 1999 was a peak period for travel. You could go more places. Everything wasn't completely crazy. I was in Prague in the year 2000. I love Prague. Prague may just well be my favorite city to visit in Europe, even still. However, the tourist situation has gotten crazier and crazier. And in the year 2000, it was a great place to visit. And I was there during the Christmas season. Later, like 10, 15 years later, I was there during the Christmas season as well. And what a difference. The Christmas season in the year 2000 was just a wonderful place to visit. The Christmas season in 2017, you couldn't even move. And we had this period where we could have worked on things. Instead, we were fighting ourselves. People were talking seriously about the internet solving all of our problems, about this being the end of history, that America was going to be the unipolar police for the globe, and all of that's going to come crashing down. How did it change? What caused it all to change? It wasn't just September 11th. We did have the Asian financial crisis, which was from 1997 to 1998, which then caused the Russian ruble collapse. Interestingly enough, there is a Solzhenitsyn book I've always wanted to read. It's a short book that he wrote during this period. He'd gone back to live in Russia, I believe in 1994. And when he went back there, he took a train from Vladivostok all the way to Moscow to just see the country and what had changed. And after a few years of this collapse, he wrote this book called Russia in Collapse. Now, they used to print all of Solzhenitsyn's work in America. They never printed that one. And I really wanted to read his impressions of why the Russia was collapsing. You had things like happening on the internet. For one thing, you had the dot-com bubble popping. So right at the year 2000, you had this collapse, this pop. And a lot of people thought, oh, that's it, the internet's over. But no, it just cleaned out a lot of the debris, the underbrush, and allowed the giants to start growing, much as happens after a fire. You also had this weird little thing called Napster, which was just this online file sharing platform, which eventually leads us to the weird world of streaming that we now inhabit, which I think is a very dark world. Yeah, it's convenient, but it's killed many things. For instance, it's killed men going out into the world and shopping. What do I mean? If I go to a mall here in Georgia, and I look at all of the stores there, I'm going to do a video on this subject. They're all directed at women, with the exception of the hardware store and what remains of a little gaming store. That is very strange. It used to be guys would go to the mall. Of course, they would eat. Who doesn't do that? But they would go to the mall or they'd go downtown and they would look for the record stores or the video stores or even the bookstores. They would look for those kind of things. Guys kind of like that kind of thing. But now, I mean, I walk through these stores and I'm going like, no, I don't want to go to that store. I don't want to go to that store. I don't want to go to that store. I'll go into this store and see if there's a pillow I need or some little piece of bad Scandinavian design, Vietnamese or Chinese made furniture. It's just a weird world that we created that starts with eliminating the physical. And more importantly, of causing people to have this mentality that the physical doesn't matter, whereas the physical absolutely matters. Also, in the year 2000, identity theft and credit card fraud and all these things were very small compared to what they are now. Banking fraud and all the rest of it. I mean, I had $600 taken out of my account because I put my name somewhere, and I'm not sure where, but then someone sold it, and I got this really bad thing. I have since changed various passwords and gotten a new card. But now you can't travel without all of these weird... It's like we've gone from an open world to a closed world. Thomas Friedman wrote this book about, the flat world, the world's growing flatter, meaning it's more open than ever. We didn't have geolocation then. We didn't have geo-blocking either. Now, I remember traveling in the year 2000. I didn't need a VPN to access my bank. I didn't need any kind of special thing on credit cards to use them all over the world. That world is gone. Now, I have to have a special card here. I have to have another card for traveling in Europe and another card for America because the cards don't all work in the same place anymore. And that's because of fraud and identity theft, which have grown. And yes, indeed, September 11th wipes away the notion that history has come to an end. And it also creates new countries that we can no longer travel to, or countries that you will travel to, and it will start to become problematic. And this tendency will only grow into the present. And I think to myself, we wasted those 10 years. We wasted them with stupid movies and entertainments. I forgot to mention all the teen movies and teen horror films and stuff. Yeah, there are some fun ones. Yeah, there's some good music, blah, blah, blah. But essentially, we turned our culture. Generation X had just entered the stage, and they were making this music that was dark and complex. And someone saw what was happening. Okay, this guy's going to die and that guy's going to die, and let's sell it to the children. And why did everyone go for that teen stuff and the kind of silly, unserious culture of the end of the 90s? And I think the reason is that we never celebrated the end of the Cold War. We never did. And so as a result, we experienced it in the sense that, okay, we're no longer focused on an enemy, although we had become our own enemies. But as far as the younger people growing up, they were quickly being trained not to see history, but to only live in this teen present. And while September 11th was going to change all that, it wasn't going to happen overnight. And meanwhile, the juvenilization had occurred. But also, I think people, the pressure was off, and so we could just relax and listen to stupid things and watch stupid things. So consequently, the last 4 or 5 years of the 90s are inconsequential culturally. Not everywhere. There's still things going on. But it's just not what the early part of the 90s was. The early part of the 90s for me was a great period. And I think anyone who lived through that period will see it. Interestingly enough, if I look at a current video by a younger person who looks back at the music of the 90s, they can't really tell the difference between Mariah Carey and Nirvana. Yeah, one is rock and one is, R&B, whatever that means. But it's just the 90s. Like, the 90s was one solid entity. And there were many interesting things happening in the 90s. More interesting things happening in Europe. But again, the Americans weren't paying attention to those things. But alas, that moment came and went. We did nothing with it but silly politics and such. Meanwhile, the big T, terrorism, was growing. And we had, in 1993, a group of Islamic terrorists tried to take down the World Trade Center. Should have been a hint. But we didn't take the message too clearly. Then there was the Oklahoma bombing. This huge building blew up. But there was other stuff as well. And you could feel it all heating up. And in fact, when I first heard of September 11th, my first thought was not Islam. Because it didn't seem like we had a big problem with Islam at that moment. My first thought was the neo-Nazi types. And it turned out to be the other way around. And, yeah. So I just wanted to point out that we went through a period where we could have done much more than we did. We chose instead, as George Will said, to take a vacation from history and not to prepare for the future. And so the internet was going to lead us into a beautiful new world where we could all communicate, and what could go wrong with that? Music was just going to keep getting better. Rock was going to stay forever. There would still be record stores. Tower Records reigned supreme in the year 2000. It was gone a few years later because of the downloading and later streaming revolution. Places disappeared. More and more security. September 11th started the security ratchet. But all this identity theft and fraud, thank you for bringing us all together, created the security nightmare we live in today. And so instead of preparing for the world, we essentially created the world we're now living in. And almost as a joke. Although there were people who thought it was going to be a wonderful time. And interestingly, I think it was Baudrillard who said, we may never arrive at the year 2000. And I thought of that over and over again when we celebrated the end of the century on December 31st, going into January 1st in the year 2000. Because that wasn't the end of the century or the millennium. But we're so deceived into seeing all those circles come, you don't realize it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Ooh, the 90s is over. 10. You have to get all the way through the year 2000 to get to the beginning of the 21st century. And when we got to the beginning of the 21st century, we were granted our wish. A new world was born, along with a lot of paranoia, really frightening horror films, a lot of seductive divas singing for us, people becoming addicted to their devices, people talking to each other through the devices and creating boogeymen and boogie women and boogie its, because what's gender, through their devices. And, well, here we are. And, but, you know, I look and I say, yeah, you got to keep in mind where you are. And maybe if people had, I don't think anything has to happen. I think we could have paid more attention. And there were parts of the 90s, they were small parts, where good things did happen. Political correctness was kind of dampened down, which was great. And then it came roaring back with vengeance. But we always have to work. And Jacques Ellul wrote in his last book on technology is like, we can't prepare for the year 2000, he said. But he said, meanwhile, technology will continue to take over, but there are always cracks of freedom. And at the moment, I think YouTube is still a bit of a crack of freedom, but the more I see how people have to become their own little branding services, and you just see it by the little thumbnails they use to describe themselves. And they call them thumbnails, which is like really bizarre. They're really more like covers for their videos. But the more you see their little mini posters, the more you realize, oh, you have to put your face on it. You have to put these block letters so that people can read it. Whereas if you go back 5-10 years, none of that existed hardly yet. Because people are self-branding. We're all becoming little mini corporations. And that's not good news. But I still think there's a bit of a crack of freedom here, so I'm still using it. How are you expressing your freedom? Let me know in the comments below. What do you think of all this? Do you think, actually I'm wrong, the 90s was a great, wonderful period, and we did everything we should have done in the 90s? Or do you think I'm right, and maybe we didn't do enough, we could have done more? And maybe at this moment we should be doing more. I think we're losing a lot of the momentum that was had around the year 2020, 2022, in that period during COVID, but before and after as well, where there was a sense of questioning of the dominant media narratives. But yeah, we haven't done it. But maybe there's always hope for individuals. I'm getting a sound. It's an alarm. What a beautiful sounding alarm. And it's telling me I have to call Alaska to do something about my about my security situation. Oh! From Georgia, this is Byrne saying subscribe, like, contribute. I make no money on any of this. And I will see you soon. Droidit.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.
get to 10. Are you ready? Happy New Year early. In 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Happy 2000!
I feel like I have no voice. I feel like I